That you can put on the
Can you
slides.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Galim. You can put on the slides and then we can start.
Yes, a moment.
Okay, let's start. I hope you all got the headphones. It's channel number 4. So number 4 is the room. Welcome to the session Securing Critical Infrastructure, Who and How. My name is Vladimir Radunovic. I'm leading cybersecurity programs for Diplo Foundation, an international educational capacity building institution. I'll be sort of a host today, together with my colleague Melanie, who is here on behalf of DPFL and C4DT. But there will be a number of distinguished experts also joining us both here and online. And there I count all of you as well. Now, critical infrastructure has become a buzzword. And we have seen it everywhere, popping up in the norm setting and policy setting frameworks, but also popping up among the professionals dealing with cybersecurity. But rarely we see how these two connect. Typically, the discussions are in silos. What we are trying to do with the Geneva Dialogue project, and you will hear in a second a bit more about that, is to connect the high-level norms, cyber norms and frameworks with the practical work in protecting critical infrastructure. But before we dive into the session, let me welcome, on behalf of Switzerland, who is the main supporter of the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior, Thomas Schneider, on behalf of Ofcom of Switzerland, to maybe put the welcome words and set the stage. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me in your head on your headphones? Yes, thank you. This is an initiative of the Swiss Federal Foreign Ministry, but we partner with them in many ways. So they've asked me to say a few things about the Geneva Dialogue and the motivation also behind this. So the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior in Cyberspace was established by the Swiss Foreign Ministry now 6 years ago. It is led by our friends from the Diplo Foundation with the support of the Republic and State of Geneva. Geneva is, in their view, as a state of themselves. The C4DT, we've already heard from APFL, Swisscom and UBS. And the aim of the dialogue is to analyze and map the roles and responsibilities of the various actors in ensuring the security and stability of cyberspace. And the Geneva Dialogue is a global dialogue building on Geneva tradition of bringing the world together. It engages some 100 companies, organizations, institutions and experts. And in 2003 and 2004 only more than 50 representatives and independent experts have contributed to the drafting of the Geneva Manual. In this context, the dialogue stems from the principle of shared responsibility and particularly asks how the agreed cyber norms can be best implemented by relevant stakeholders together as a means to contribute to international security and peace. Concretely, the Geneva Dialogue investigates the consequences of agreed upon norms for the relevant stakeholders. It does not try to find consensus, but to document existing views of such stakeholders on their roles and responsibilities in the Geneva Manual, as well as give good practices that should inspire others and promote responsible behavior in cyberspace. So this inaugural edition of the manual focuses on 2 norms related to supply chain security and reporting of ICT vulnerabilities. This year, the Geneva Dialogue discusses the operationalization of the critical infrastructure-related norms, and the sessions at the SICW is another important opportunity to gather international feedback from various experts for the next chapter of the Geneva Manual. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion and hope you all enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. So briefly, what the outline of the session will look like. We'll start with a short overview of what is the main challenge that we try to address and what is the Geneva Dialogue all about. My colleague Anastasia remotely will run us through that. And then we'll play a little bit. And I think that's the point of making most of the sessions useful, but also interesting. So we'll have a scenario game with cards, and we'll break up in groups. We'll try to step into shoes of governments, operators of critical infrastructures, researchers. And then after that, we'll get back to a plenary discussion to reflect a little bit on main issues that were raised. I'll pass the floor now to Nastia to lead us through the main issues and the Geneva Dialogue, and then to drive us into the scenario exercise that we'll play. Nastia, over to you.
Thank you, Vlada. I hope you can hear me all good?
Loud and clear.
Super. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Unfortunately, it's only my virtual face, but I assure you my enthusiasm is 100% real. My name is Anastasia Kazakova. I'm a Cyber Diplomacy Knowledge Fellow at Diplom, and I'm also part of the Geneva Dialogue team. And within my 10 minutes, I'm going to briefly tell the story of what we do within Geneva Dialogue. And I think the perfect example would be this fictional story, which, of course, unfortunately inspired by real events. So let's imagine a large logistics company identified as a critical infrastructure operator, which was hit by a ransomware attack because the threat actors managed to target the weak security at the company's service provider. And the service provider happened to be a small Armenian company which provides cloud services and manages the cloud infrastructure of that logistics company. Imagine a part of a whole infrastructure of your company being frozen just because you are interdependent with other companies across supply chains. But of course, you have little control over the security of other actors across supply chains. The challenge that you are inevitably affected and your infrastructure might be at risk. And that's, I think, one of the default scenarios across different actors across supply chains where different products, infrastructure are being interconnected with inherent vulnerabilities and a potential for malicious actors to target this. One of the main questions for us that we'll look at, and this perfect story provides us the example, who is responsible for taking action to mitigate cyber risks and protect critical infrastructure across borders and supply chains. Fortunately, there is some guidance. Almost 10 years ago, states formulated and agreed on a set of norms for responsible state behavior at the UN, and some of the norms specifically agreed on to ensure supply chain security, report ICT vulnerabilities, and also to protect critical infrastructure. There are questions, though, how these norms guide actors in protecting critical infrastructure, and how can specifically non-state stakeholders, which is the private sector, academia, civil society, technical community, can implement the norms and support states' efforts. So this is the questions that we'll look at the Geneva Dialogue, which is the global dialogue. We build a community and we discuss the roles, responsibilities of different actors in cyberspace to facilitate responsible behavior, implement the norms, and address cyber risks. The initiative has been running since 2018, and there was a lot of work been done since then. In 2023, we started exclusively looking at the implementation of the norms, and since then you can see that more than 60 contributors, which represent organizations, businesses, and also individual experts who participate on a personal capacity, have contributed to the Geneva Dialogue. All of these contributors come from more than 20 countries from different regions, and that highlights that Geneva Dialogue is truly about the global community connecting different people in different parts of the world. In our community, we look at the 4 main stakeholder groups. So as I mentioned, this includes non-state stakeholders represented by the private sector and industry, academia, civil society, and technical community, which is mostly represented by open source community, cybersecurity researchers, and incident response experts. As there are 11 norms that we need to look at, we started to discuss them step by step. And in 2023, we started first with the 2 norms related to vulnerabilities and supply chain security. So that was the first step of our work. The outcomes were published in the Geneva Manual, the comprehensive guidance on how the stakeholders can help support the state's efforts, other efforts in the community, and implement the norms. This year, we expanded the scope and started looking at the 3 norms, which we grouped as the norms related to protection of the critical infrastructure protection. We did quite a lot of work, and here there's just some of the examples. In 2020, we already discussed different good practices which the private sector implements to build the secure by design products and reduce vulnerabilities in them. In 2021, there was a study that where we looked at the different governance approaches of selected countries to regulate the security of digital products. Essentially, that was a solid basis for us to more actively look into the implementation of the relevant norms and produce the first chapter of the manual in 2023. Structurally speaking, the Geneva Manual provides different inputs, and we intentionally want to keep this document user-friendly for different stakeholders with different backgrounds. So when we discuss roles responsibilities, there's the first element, when we identified a particular role which is important to implement the norm. Then we also look at the responsibilities, the incentives, this is the Y element, different challenges which stakeholders might have, which serve as a barriers for them to implement the norms, and the good practices. Hopefully that might be helpful for those who are not part of the Geneva Dialogue, but who might be interested to make the contributions and find different useful experiences from Geneva Dialogue experts. And specifically, when we discussed the norms related to vulnerabilities and supply chain security, we identified 5 roles. So you see them on the right side. And specifically, I just want to highlight that civil society was also highlighted as one of the roles by our experts, because we believe that, and we heard the feedback from our experts, that civil society, especially those actors who are involved in policy, advocacy, and research, might be a really important element, putting the pressure on both state actors and the private sector to implement the norms and facilitate implementation of the relevant security practices. Today's session is one of the further steps for us to collect international feedback, which is increasingly important for us to produce the final chapter of our work this year with the focus on the critical infrastructure protection. So early next year, we are going to announce the next chapter, the second chapter, with a focus on critical infrastructure protection. Just to give you a brief example of the level of discussions that we have in the Geneva Dialogue, there are some preliminary TBC findings that we're able to hear from our experts. Not going to read out all of them, and we would be actually happy to share the finalist version early next year, as I just said. But just to give you some of the examples of what we discuss. So when we unpack those norms, which are the result of the diplomatic agreements between states at the UN, our non-state stakeholders and experts highlighted different concerns. One of them is the lack of the international efforts to understand and protect cross-jurisdictional interdependencies in some critical infrastructure sectors that might have regional and international impact. The other point that we also heard is that critical infrastructure is governed by national legal frameworks, and some states prefer to keep a high level of secrecy due to national security reasons. However, a lack of sufficient transparency for stakeholders, specifically domestic stakeholders, was highlighted as one of the barriers for them to support state efforts in critical infrastructure protection. And therefore, different experts have highlighted that transparency about how states see the approach to protect critical assets is an important element to make sure that stakeholders are aware of those efforts. Another example of what we so far have heard from our experts, and that would be the topic of our tabletop exercise, a lack of universal baseline or minimum cybersecurity requirements to protect critical infrastructure. The suggestion came from the discussion that, again, there's acknowledgement that critical infrastructure is governed by national legal frameworks. However, there are connections between different critical infrastructure facilities through transnational essential services or other types of the infrastructure. And that actually raised different, more or less universal questions about the security across the supply chains for critical infrastructure operators. The question then further, how to make the different legal systems which govern critical infrastructure and the security in them more or less interoperable, so the actors who face more or less the same security issues might already have a common basis, at least baseline understanding on how to address those security issues. I'd like to stop here and just make a call that, as I mentioned, we build the community, and we also welcome the input of our interested stakeholders to support our work and also contribute with their expertise. So the first chapter of the manual that we produced last year is published, and you can see the link on the website. That's open to the feedback. You can get in touch with us directly. And at the same link, we are going to announce the next chapter of the Geneva manual. And ultimately, we would welcome other stakeholders who are interested, who have time and passion. Please join us to discuss these important topics. So thank you very much. I'd like to briefly then go to the next segment, as Vlada mentioned. We have the tabletop exercise, which will be with the main focus on discussing possible universal minimum baseline security measures for critical infrastructure protection. And before we explain the rules for participants on site and virtually, we prepared the fictional scenario, and to explain it perfectly, we prepared also the video, and hope that will be a little bit entertainment today. So I'm gonna to launch the video, and please let me know if you can hear it perfectly.
We don't hear the sound, though it's not necessary. You can try to see if you can put the sound on, but we have the script.
Okay, on my side, the sound is the maximum.
Is the sound also shared?
I hope so.
Even if not, I mean, it's very visual and it's inside, so it's fine.
Okay, so I continue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something significant had happened. Mr. Martin.
Come in. I've been waiting for you. We'll skip the formalities. Global Flow Logistics has a big security problem. IT will handle that. We need your services to deal with a different type of problem. Needless to say, I expect absolute discretion.
Wasn't even us they targeted directly.
The breach had come through Nimbus Tech Solutions.
Could you explain what happened?
The attackers have exploited vulnerabilities in Nimbus Tech Systems' poor network segregation, weak access controls, and outdated patches. Once inside, they moved into the infrastructure of the cloud service provider OmniCloud, eventually further slipping into, among other clients, into GFL IT systems. I assume something similar to this scenario happened.
All our systems are blocked. The key infrastructure is offline.
What happened? We need answers now.
I'm working as fast as I can. The threat actors breached our systems and the entire supply chain that supported critical infrastructure across the region.
Get the global flow online and fast. Their infrastructure goes offline and puts the entire critical infrastructure in our country at risk.
Great. Now all systems are blocked.
I just had a call from the government. They are asking for answers. Ms. Wong?
This was no ordinary cyber attack. It was a full-scale assault on the networks that kept modern society moving.
It seems that it had all started with a simple, preventable breach in a small company. the consequences would echo for weeks. But at that moment, she only had a few hours to figure out how to stop the bleeding before the entire structure crumbled.
So that was the scenario. That was a really short explanation of what happened. And the main idea, it's completely fictional, that there was a supply chain attack, targeted a large logistics company for weak security of the service provider. And that affected multiple critical infrastructure industries in the country. So currently, at this moment, we'd like to proceed discussing this scenario in several groups, and I'll just want to briefly explain the rules. The main goal would be, through this scenario and the 3 questions that we prepared, in smaller groups to discuss what could be possible, those minimum cybersecurity requirements for, first of all, critical infrastructure operators and relevant stakeholders, service providers, to protect critical infrastructure. There would be 3 roles, so we want to look at this problem through different perspectives, through different lenses: government, critical infrastructure industry, and cybersecurity research stakeholder roles. And we will have also team captains for each group, on-site and virtually. And as I mentioned, we will have 3 questions for each group. Those questions you can see on the slide. So basically, one of the first questions, what universal baseline security should be mandated for the operators? The next question with the focus on the same security requirements, but for the service providers. If you see the difference between them, or you believe that might be actually a closer approach to define those security measures for service providers as for the critical infrastructure operators. And the third question, a little bit optional if you still have the time, which steps are required at a regional and international level to ensure these requirements are effectively implemented across different sectors and jurisdictions? The question mostly targets different international efforts. If you see the necessity, especially in currently complex, geopolitically complex environment. We mentioned we also have team captains. So on site, we will have several groups. The group which will be playing on behalf of government will be led the speakers, Dr. Bushra Al-Bushi from Dubai Electronic Security Center, joined by Melanie Kalbeguillot from Center for Digital Trust at APFL. The next group will be looking at the same problem, but through the lens of the critical infrastructure facility, will be led by Maria Pericas Riera from German Council on Foreign Relations and my colleague Vladimir Radonovich from Diplo Foundation. And hopefully the co-host on site will allow us also to let our participants virtually to speak. So we will have the third group virtually with the team captains, Kalim Usmani from CERT Mauritius, Nicholas Grunder from ABB, Klee Icahn from FIRST, and Kazuo Noguchi from Hitachi America. Vlada, over to you if you have would like to add something before we proceed to the groups.
Thank you, Nastya. Well, as you can see, we have quite some ladies, which is a nice surprise in cybersecurity areas, not so often. What we are going to do now, we're going to break into I'll add another group because there is a huge number of people in the room. So on this side of the room, I invite everyone who wants to play a role of the government to just move there slowly. They'll be led by Dr. Bushra and Melanie. On this side of the room, we'll have all those that want to play the role of the critical infrastructure operators. Think about critical infrastructure in whatever way you want. Hospitals, transportation, energy, whatever. In this case, we have a transportation issue. Maria will lead that group. I'll take the third group, which is the cybersecurity researchers, incident responders, and techies, in a way, in this part of the room. What we are going to do, my colleagues will give us the scenario. So this video that you saw, you also get in a comic book format. So we'll have a few minutes to go to the comic book to remind ourselves. Then we'll get the cards. Each group will have the cards, which will enable us to discuss the options, to choose a couple of cards that are priority options based on 3 questions that Anastasia looked at. Now, the important thing, the scenario shows something that happened, an incident. We're not responding to an incident. We are rolling the time backwards and saying, what should have we done so that this doesn't happen? So think about rolling backwards and say, if we have done this measure which says maintain and up-to-date all the digital assets of the critical infrastructure, this might not have happened, and so on. Do not tie too much to the incident. Get in the shoes, be real, but don't go into details of the incidents. We are trying to see how the global norms and these practical issues are connected. Okay. Those that want to play the government, move to that side. Those that want to play the critical infrastructure, move here. And techies, that side of the room, stretch a little bit, and we start in a few minutes. We'll have about 20, 25 minutes to discuss in groups, and the colleagues, the leaders, will tell us what to do. Thank you.
All right, so we will proceed virtually. I hope the participants on site can hear us. So Kalim, the floor to you, and I will start sharing the screen with the Miro board where we have the questions and the cards as well. Just a moment. And if you allow me, I will briefly explain what we'll have at the Miro before you will take the floor. So
sure.
Hopefully you could see this.
Yes, I can.
Yes. Perfect. So we have the story which we just we watched the video, and we have 3 questions we will be playing on behalf of the cybersecurity researchers. These are the 3 questions which I already announced. The only thing is that the third question that we have is a bit different from other groups. So the third question is about thinking what steps could be proposed at the regional international level to overcome restrictions that hinder the sharing of critical vulnerability information among relevant stakeholders. So that's, I just wanted to highlight if we still have the time to discuss this. So this is the Miro board. I will be listening to you, all of you, and the discussion will be led by our team captains. And basically with the sticky notes, I will put the main tag words and the main ideas that you have. We also, on this board, we have cards, which are sort of the ideas to support your answers to the question. So if you wish, I can give you also the access to the board, so you could also collaboratively check all the suggestions here. You just need to send me your email directly in the chat, and I will be able to add you, so you will be able to play at the board as well while we all discuss. That's all I wanted to tell right now. Let me know if you have any questions so far.
Anastasia, just a question. So our role is researchers, right?
Right.
And then the question is, what universal baseline cybersecurity measures should be mandated for CI operators to protect their infrastructure? From the point of view of researchers? You see what I mean?
Yeah, that's correct. So
Okay.
the researchers as a part of the supply chains, the idea is to look from their lens, what are the requirements should be mandated for the operators and then for the service providers.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. So if there are no further questions, I don't see anything in the chat, then I'll stop speaking, and Kalim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and good afternoon, everyone. As Anastasia has mentioned, we are the cybersecurity research stakeholder group, and then as announced during before just starting this scenario exercise, that we are having some 20-25 minutes, and we are having some 3 questions around. One, universal baseline cybersecurity measures should be mandated for CI operators to protect their infrastructure. And again, in terms of the CIO operators, in terms of the service providers. So basically what we're trying to do here is that we are encouraging the participants to come up with their suggestions, and then we will be opening the floor soon. But before that, we will also be having our colleague, Nicholas, who will be again talking about the first very question onto the CI operators. So we will wait a little bit onto that, and then maybe we can start.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kaleem. I think I would not add too many more words, as we only have 25 minutes. I suggest that we just get started, right? And Anastasia, I was not so sure with the cards. It's probably difficult to pull up the cards with suggestions, right? So maybe we. So I suggest that we maybe just start with someone from the participants considering what should be some baseline security measures and suggestions. I think we should just open the discussion of anyone who would propose suggestions and why you would have such a suggestion.
Sure. So I think we are having one hand raise, Imad. Please go ahead. Thank you.
One thing that comes to my mind for researchers to make some requirements for critical infrastructure operators is first to understand the critical infrastructure. First, it's not clear for all the researchers what is a critical infrastructure, even in their own in their own country. Second thing, they don't know what is the supply chain of this critical infrastructure, right? Here, there's a big question, which is, should the critical infrastructure make it transparent? How they depend, what are their providers? There are some pros and some cons against this.
All right. Maybe also another aspect of it is that we are trying to focus from the organizational and the technical measures. So meaning to say that what could be the organizational measures that these CII operators, they should be putting in place, and as well as the technical measures, what they should be putting in place. As Ahmad said that, first of all, it is important for us to understand that what are the critical infrastructure, what it is, how do we identify that, how do we carry out the risk assessment, what organizational structure is required. So I think these are the aspects, Nicholas, I think we will be, but again, we are having one more hand raised, Paula. So Paula, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaleem. Just adding on to what the previous contribution was, understanding what critical infrastructure is. So for instance, if the nation deems that maybe the health sector is critical infrastructure, what the health sector needs to do as a start is to identify what assets they are in charge of, what assets they have. That way, they'll be able to know what needs to be protected, what should be classified as high risk, what should be classified as low risk. And this is maybe more on the operational side. So they should be able to understand what assets they have as the health sector, what's critical for the nation to have and to deem as critical infrastructure, what should be protected first. If the health sector was attacked, what would cause the biggest challenge to the health sector? So a basic understanding of what their assets are, or sort of like an asset inventory.
All right, thank you, Paula. So I think again, the question which is coming here is that how do we identify critical infrastructures, and what are the ways of doing it? So maybe we are having the Nicholas on board from ABB. Nicholas, would you be able to share a little bit of experience where what are the ways and what are the sort of in a way baseline questions or kind of a checklist which helps the organizations in order to identify their critical infrastructures. Obviously, in different countries, critical infrastructures, they vary a little bit as compared to the other country. But as per your experience, Nicholas, would you quickly tell us a little bit that how to identify and then how to carry out the risk identification around, so that clearly they're able to identify which sectors are or could be considered as critical?
Yeah, I think Kalim, you mentioned, you know, it may vary between the countries depending on the industries they're actually having. But I think what is something common is looking at the impact. So what impact does it have if a certain company or a certain type of providers of infrastructure would be taken out of service either partially or completely, and what impact does it have on individuals, on the functioning of certain services, and it's basically about defining the services that are critical for functioning of society, right? And so of course it's very high level, but I think that would be something important, as we have heard, is if there is at least some sort of a common understanding. And I think now looking at also from a provider of products and services into critical infrastructure, so basically looking at the supply chain, that's of course is important for the providers of products into critical infrastructure, because we will have to actually employ and deploy and develop cybersecurity measures for the products that are then secure to be used in these critical infrastructures. So looking at the question, what is the universal baseline? I think that it's probably difficult to formulate conclusively what is critical infrastructure, but giving some of the criteria, what based on the impact it can have, I think that would be certainly helpful.
Thank you, Nicholas, and also I think along with this particular group, we are having two other experts, and one is Klee from FROST and one is Kazuo, and maybe we can also hear from Klee. Klee, do you have some sort of in a way the explanation around what Nicholas has added, Klee, that how and what are the best practices for identifying critical infrastructures? Because normally we see that, as Nicholas mentioned, that's the key. That's the key. Once we have, and then also some reflection onto the part of the governance and the risk management, that how the whole governance of this critical information infrastructure protection has to happen in a country, and then we move on to the next level of understanding. So Klee, the floor is yours.
Good, everyone, and thanks, Kalim. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of the basic baseline cybersecurity measures and things like that, obviously there's the normal level that you'd expect from any type of organization, but by being critical infrastructure, you do have these additional requirements that are placed upon your organization. In terms of determining which organizations fall into that category, it's very much determined by each individual government and their approach and their perspective. You know, we've had conversations with folks in the Pacific, for example, where, you know, certain cultural aspects or assets or tourism-related assets that wouldn't necessarily be considered critical infrastructure in other countries were deemed critical infrastructure, at least in the exercises that we were doing. So it's really important, as Nicholas said, to look at what is that impact on the individual economy. So that's national security perspective, that's an economic perspective, and most importantly, as Nastia and Vlada kind of hinted at in the beginning, is looking also at the human impact, both directly in terms of, you know, for example, health and human services and that impact on people's health and their ability to get treatment and emergency care, but also kind of the flow-on impacts that can have effects on individuals. 2 weeks ago, we were on a panel, and one of the speakers was speaking about the ransomware incident in Australia last year, and one of the challenges that they faced was finding means to coordinate between the federal government, the state governments, and being able to reach from a cyber perspective into women's shelters, because very sensitive information about folks staying in those facilities were leaked through the ransomware incident. So you have to really focus on those kind of flow-on third-order impacts that wouldn't necessarily come to mind. So critical infrastructure can get very complicated to define. But yeah, it's just important to focus on that impact on individuals, national security, and economy.
Thank you very much, Clay. And another aspect also is like in terms of organizational measures we have been talking about. And then also the other important aspect is the technical measures, because both are the combination. Because if you want to protect structure, then obviously both organizational and technical measures are important, because organizational measures normally they govern the whole technical measures implementation. So we are having a hand, and then maybe we'll get back to Kazuo onto the technical measures. Imad, you have the floor, and then we move on.
Yeah, here I am again. Regarding the impact, if it is very complicated to measure the impact of a flow in a given infrastructure because of the dependencies. Let's say if you are cutting water, okay, water is critical infrastructure, and then, well, how long will the society survive? Just because of the lack of water, but it's also for cooling, for instance, for cooling generators or for cooling whatever, then electricity might depend on the water. Everything else depends on the electricity. And trying to measure how much dependent water is on electricity or vice versa, this is super hard, right? What may help in this direction, what may help the researchers is, for each critical infrastructure service, they can define what they depend on and what other stuff depend on them. So input and output dependencies. This may be helpful for researchers, right? In order to assess the impact of attacks.
Sure, thank you very much. And I think interdependencies is the key into defining the critical infrastructures. I totally agree.
Yeah.
And this is an area which complex area which we need to look into and work on to. And I think for today's discussion, interdependencies of the critical infrastructure is one of the area to be discussed and have the thought process onto that. Imad, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I would add to the note that it's inward and outward for each service, right? So it's not only if I am electricity, I'm an electricity provider. It's not only what I depend on, but I can also list what other services depend on me. You see what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
I just may add, I just seen a comment that Paulo Carlos made, and he mentioned continuity planning, and I think this is a very important baseline. So what's the goal of protecting critical infrastructure? So the goal is that it can continue to operate, and having the business continuity and the recovery planning in place. Having played that, I think that is also an important requirement that actually should be applicable across the board, regardless of jurisdiction, right? Because you want to keep it running.
Thanks, Nicholas. And again, that's again a good point. Of course, continuity and business continuity is important, and especially here we are talking about the design continuity, and that is again an important aspect. So maybe even Kazuo is with us,
Yes.
and Kazuo.
Yes,
Coming back to
great nuggets here already. Ultimately, for critical infrastructure to be sustainable or resilient, any attacks can be tolerated. So how long it can be sustained, regardless of attacks. How to create not to be kind of down. So that's one of the resilience measure. But impact analysis I totally agree. The consequences as well as the risks measure, particularly to the human lives. And from that, investment and the priorities and the resources should be allocated accordingly. But critical infrastructure are named based on the countries like 15 or 13 or 18. So those are adding based on the risks and human lives these days for the technical advancement. In addition, these new additional things such as AI can be impacted quite well, positively and negatively. How to make those measures or risks or consequences human lives should be properly put into the context. So let me stop here.
Thank you. And so obviously, the discussion is moving towards that. How do we identify the services? What is the importance of interdependencies inward and outward? Again, secure your supply chain. This is again is coming up out of this particular discussion. Even impact analysis is important. I think this was mentioned by Nicholas as well as Klee. This is also something what we need to have once we are talking about the baseline security measures, which we need to have, and we move on accordingly. So still, I think we are having some 3 to 4 minutes for us to discuss around that. And any other questions from the floor, maybe that we can take it up, and then we can summarize quickly, and then we can have a last round with the experts here, and then maybe we can wrap up this part of the discussion. So any questions from the floor? Yeah, Paula. You have the floor,
maybe.
Paula.
Thanks. Maybe not a question per se, but I think there should also be an aspect of training for the employees and awareness because of the industry, or because of how quickly cybersecurity changes and things are moving. There's constant need to be up to date with how to protect critical infrastructure. So there's need for training for staff that are working on that critical infrastructure, but also the general awareness for staff that interact with the infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Paula. And coming back, one more thing, which is connecting, of course, because even training and awareness is important. Another aspect also, once we are talking about the technical measures here, is again compliance and standards, and I think that connects a part of very much as a cybersecurity measure onto the CI operators. So maybe I can open the floor to the experts and around compliance and standards for this as a cybersecurity measure for the CI operators, and then maybe we can wrap up this session here. So I'll start with Nicholas, and then Klee, and then to Kazu. And after that, if there is any final question which we have, that we can take it up, and then we can close. So over to you, Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you, Kaleem. I think standards is absolutely essential, especially if you look at it from perspective of a globally operating company. I think that is where the big benefit of cooperation or global cooperation is essential. That there are certain standards that you can also rely upon, and that they apply in country A and in country B and in country C, and that would then be actually the real baseline. And now trying to look, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not a researcher, but trying to look at it from a researcher's perspective, I think that is where researchers can play a huge role in actually defining these standards, right? Because that's something, when you look at it from a technical perspective, that's very much something where the researchers will actually provide the input.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. Over to you, Klee, for your final thoughts around compliance with standards for critical infrastructure operators, for them to implement as a cybersecurity measure.
Yeah, definitely. So with standards and compliance, there's obviously the clear value of the standards to help teams to uplift their cybersecurity. But there's also kind of the responsibility on government when you're defining certain industries and certain organizations as critical infrastructure to create certainty of the expectations that you have on the companies. So that's a pretty critical role that can be played. And you can look not only at the technical standards and technical expectations and policies that need to be in place, but also responsibilities around reporting as well as communications. Because again, we're looking at critical infrastructure because of the flow-on impact that it has on the wider economy and individuals. So thinking about other aspects beyond just technical expectations when you're developing these types of standards is quite important.
Thank you very much, Clay. And I think Kazuo, he comes from the research community, and I think he could add up onto that part.
Yes. So ultimately, global supply chains are really complex, and including small companies and the small nations, and built onto the supply chain, software, hardware, IoT, and the people in the supply chain. And how to make sure that the end-to-end is working well, and all the service providers to protect those, including databases, as well as those chains and the hardware chains, which is part of this exercise. But software supply chain there is also, and the database are all connected. So all the researchers to analyze those and some vulnerabilities to get to know and protect constantly. Those are the part of the measures. Particularly automated things are coming up and all connected, physical as well as the virtual things. This case is cloud, which is a new type of perhaps the critical infrastructure category, perhaps. So how we can make sure that all connected things can be protected well. So those are going forward.
Thank you very much, Kazuo. So more or less, I think we are getting into the shape of understanding that what should be the basic or baseline cybersecurity measures should be mandated for CI operators. And the discussion which has come up here is how do you identify, what are the ways of identifying, and understanding the structure of the CI. I think this is another aspect which we have been talking about. Interdependencies was something, again, we have been discussing that how the interdependencies inbound and outbound, that has to be seen in order for us to look at the complete visibility of the supply chain attacks, in order to identify the CIs and accordingly put cybersecurity measures in place. We also have been talking about the impact analysis, because this is impact analysis is important in order for you to identify whether the CI is critical or not. This is, again, I think what we have been talking about. Another discussion which came up as a time of as a baseline cybersecurity is also the business continuity and even the incident response plans. They're important aspect of having that baseline cybersecurity measure in place for the CI operators. Also, we have been about those plans, and then obviously implement the vulnerability management, and of course the securing the data. That's the data protection. So that's the important aspect. Again, what we finally, I think.
Shall we start?
Yes, I think we just finished, and thank you very much, Vlada. Thank you very much, Liam. So I guess we're wrapping up this part, and if anyone has any further comments, we will keep the chat open. But thank you so much. I'll put the slides back.
Thank you, Nas. Playing in different shoes. So I joined how to.
Vlada, apologies. I think we can't really hear you properly. You are disappearing from time to time.
This one, yeah. didn't sing enough. You know, if I sang enough, I would know how to microphone. Thank you. Okay, we move to the last part of our session to discuss a little bit, couple of questions that we had for the roundtable. And we start with a question on, well, Nastia, you can probably show the questions. We start with a practical aspect, then we try to connect with cyber norms and confidence building measures. At this point, I'll pass the floor to Melanie to lead, but I invite you to jump at any point, raise a hand. We want to interact, right? Melanie, over to you.
Okay, fantastic. So please, now we're starting out with our discussion rounds. And I really invite everyone to also report from their group what they found was most interesting, speaking also a little bit from which perspective you were talking about, and also what your reasoning was. So the first question we want to discuss is how can we effectively protect critical infrastructure, facilities, and assets that do have national, regional, or international impact. So in particular, what practical measures should be implemented? And importantly, which stakeholders need to be engaged in this? Right, so we're trying to kind of go between our online audience and the in-room audience. I would like to start very quickly with our Zoom people. Nicolas, would you start out?
Yeah, Melanie, thank you very much. And I'm also reporting a little bit of what we discussed in the group, and we were the researchers group. And interestingly, the first questions, as from the perspective of the researcher, is what is actually critical infrastructure. And so we delved a bit into that topic and seen that, you know, critical infrastructure might be defined differently from jurisdiction to jurisdictions, but essentially what we've seen important is that there is some sort of a baseline that is developed based on the impact that an incident can have. And then we very quickly we started talking about standards as well, which I think we all think it can be very beneficial. And standards not only being technical standards, yes, that's an important part of it, but also organizational standards, incident response notifications, etc., etc. So it's that kind of broad array. But let me open the discussion again to the group of people as well.
Right, fantastic. Someone else, what practical measures do you think are really important? Anyone in the room who would like to give it a go? Yes, volunteers? Dr. Bushra, go ahead.
Thank you so much first of all for the invitation and for the very nice interactive session that we had so far. Just to reflect on a few practices that we've been doing in United Arab Emirates or in Dubai, and few of the practices that we were doing also internationally with the World Economic Forum. Reaching to an agreement what is critical infrastructure and reaching to a common agreement at the regional level or national level might be challenging, but reaching to unified agreement to the policies, regulations that we can all deploy on our service providers, whether those service providers are cloud providers, software providers, or even the critical infrastructure operators themselves. I think we are all doing common things, but we need just to come together in order to say, okay, those are common things, let's agree on them internationally. And we published a report with the World Economic Forum in 2021, where we will calling for harmonized certification for individuals, professionals, service providers, and even products. You can find the report in website. It's called for harmonized certification report with the World Economic Forum. Out of that report, actually, there was an action that was taken forward. So there is an international coalition that was created for cybersecurity professional certification, where more countries they came together, and we met last November in Wilton Park, and we came out with agreed, let's say, set of definitions for certification accreditation within the professional domain. If that can be done for cybersecurity professionals, why not for other domains? Why not for cloud providers? Why not for softwares? And also there is a platform for certifying hardware devices. It's called Common Criteria, and where multiple countries, they came together, they are agreeing on minimum security requirements for hardware devices and ICT hardware devices. If that can be also done, and it was done, and it was proven to be effective, then we can do something similar at providers level or even software level. So for me, priority one is to agree whether regionally or internationally on the minimum security requirements, certification requirements that can be done for the service providers. Why I need to certify cloud provider in multiple countries with the same regulations or same requirements.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. This is precisely what we were actually talking about in our group, which was the government group, is like some sort of credential, some kind of checkup system and management of the service providers, and especially those for critical infrastructure providers. Let me revert back to our Zoom. Kazu, could you chime in, please?
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. So it was a really interesting scenario case that we had in short period of time. To remind myself for the question that Vlad mentioned, how to make it better before it happens. One of the critical things for the infrastructure provider is that the backup. And backup system in the different geography and the countries, regions, so that to spread their risks. That's one thing that we can do. The difficult part here, the scenario is a new one, global cloud provider. Sometimes difficult to know, identify single point of failure, but it's great to have as a measure. And the data perspectives for the supply chain, including people, sometimes happening, how to make the measure so that the data integrity, also the hardware, software, supply chains integrity should be made properly. And the zero trust architecture is coming up. For instance, the development, also the good for security by design and the default for the users. So risk scenario, we talked in this the online discussions, how to make the good consequences, risk assessment, and all interdependent to the business as well as people, how to make that impact analysis to clarify how critical it is, and to based on those critical infrastructures level, how to make the prepared investment and prepare not to happen, and for the resilience perspective, although cloud may be not working, but there may be the way to get around. And for the United Nations GGE and OEWG 11 norms, those are great starting point for the operationalization, as Anastasia mentioned. This one is a good guide, and good capacity building for that is ultimately the confidence building, and also the confidence building, meaning that communicate well. And the UN Open-Ended Working Group started the point of contacts globally, more than 110 countries, and communicate through those for the private or stakeholders are good or initiative through all the channels of the nation jurisdictions. Finally, the prevention and resilience coming up some are identified, for instance, in the EU, but prevention, how to make the better use of AI, for instance, to detect and patch well, and to address the vulnerabilities beforehand, what's happening. But ultimately, for the operators to be sustainable, that's critical for life. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kazu. You packed a bunch of operationalizations. Thank you very much to also put this a little bit in the global perspective, in the interdependence between service provider, critical infrastructures, and of course the governments. I would like to see one more person from our live audience. Yes, we have someone. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm assuming here that the hacker and the country that has been hacked are in peace, I mean, between their two countries. However, there is a probability that the both countries are in war. And I'm believing that there should be a framework under the United Nations with a pattern of infrastructure. Now, shall I repeat, or with listed infrastructure, items, and should be agreed between everywhere around the world that those elements should not be touched in peace or wars by cyber crimes. For example, even if there is a war, electricity, water, and transportation shouldn't be touched or affected even in those circumstances. I think this is one of the agreements that should be in place these days, in order to avoid such future problems.
Thank you, fantastic. And you kind of skipped a bit to question number 3 already, because that's exactly an important point to consider. So we will come back to this, thank you. So let's move to the second question. Now we looked at the practical measures, and we kind of want to come back to what the roles of cyber norms is, right? The roles of cyber norms, especially FG&H that we discussed, and confidence building measures, CBMs, when it comes to the protection of critical infrastructure. So they are voluntary in nature, right? Do you think they have an impact on the protection of critical infrastructure, although they're clearly voluntary? Vlada, go ahead.
Yes, I actually wanted to connect to what our colleague mentioned. The context that we are discussing this is the UN agreement within the General Assembly, ultimately before by all the states of the UN about these cyber norms and confidence building measures. And exactly as you said, one of the norms is do not attack each other's critical infrastructure and boost the resilience of each other's infrastructure. And some of the CBMs, the confidence building measures that the countries have agreed, include something that we have in the cards and that we have discussed in the groups, such as work on understanding how each country defines the critical infrastructure. Probably we'll never be able to agree on agreement. Common agreement of what is critical infrastructure everywhere. But this is one of the CBMs to try to exchange it and understand. And then the other one is capacity building, which we mentioned in our group, I guess in ours, in others, capacity building across the board of the government. But also, for instance, there was a good point of training of the suppliers towards their customers in critical infrastructure. What are the risks? So what I want to say is, even if these norms are voluntary, all the states have agreed. Even if they would be binding, it's a good question if states would be adhering to them. We see breaking the international law every day. But I think the measures that we discussed are very practical ones which directly contribute to implementing the norms and CBMs. My question maybe back is to what extent the governments which made the agreement understand this, that this is the implementation. Back to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much. Kalim, actually, we're calling you as head of CERT in Mauritius.
Thank you, Melanie. And I think this is a good question all the way with the role of cyber norms and confidence building measures when it comes to the protection of CI. Does the voluntary nature have an impact on the protection of CI? I think the answer is very much yes, and this is what Vladimir has been talking about. And there are a few things around quickly, how they're going to help, and being voluntary in nature, all these 11 norms, and especially I think this is what we have been studying. So what they basically do and how they help, and though they are voluntary, first of all, what they do is that they try to reduce the risk of cyber attacks, and I think that's the point what we are talking about, because and why they do that, because they norms establish the prohibition of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure during a peacetime, and examples are like even very much mentioned into the GG report of 2021 and the OEWG report of 2021, as well as what we are talking right now through the OEWG dollar, which is going on currently, and then it will be maturing in July 2025. So yes, and then also one of the component here is that they act as a deterrent, in fact, against state-sponsored threats by encouraging accountability. So I think that's another aspect, which again, where voluntary non-binding norms they help into protecting critical infrastructures, because there are some 3-4 norms are specifically around CIIs. If you look at the all 11 norms, and including the supply chain and the vulnerability, so of course they all connect. Now also they foster international cooperation if we talk on those lines, and especially sharing the threat intelligence component against targeting CIIs. And also the states collaborate under these principles to build a global resilience to cyber threats. That's another aspect. I think that's how the norms they help into protecting CIIs. And also they enhance the incident reporting mechanism. This is, I think, coming from the technical community. That's an important aspect once we are talking about the incident handling and resolution of the critical infrastructure, especially, for example, into the SCADA systems or illicit technology environment. And maybe also the last component which I wanted to add here is the promoting accountability and responsible behavior. And I think that's what a gentleman from the audience has said, that there has to be some sort of an agreement where the states, they should not be attacking to the essential services, like, for example, electrical grid or water supply. So that's another aspect, and this is where the contribution of the incident response teams that comes to picture. So maybe I'll stop here. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Kaleem. Thank you very much. We have one more intervention from the audience.
So this intervention is within the context of the talent discussions and the 2 consequent manuals that have been released. So there has been international consensus on the fact that you cannot attack cyber critical infrastructure, but the problem lies in identifying those infrastructures. And a potential solution for this could be regional cooperation. For example, where we are, the Middle East could agree on any infrastructure relating to oil could be critical to them, and it could be established, and there could be regional cooperation setting up a body of its own for the region. And this could be done globally with certain regions focusing on their own vulnerabilities, and then this could potentially pave the way forward for international cooperation.
Right. Before we move to the last question, any more assessments on the impact that you think cyber norms and CBMs can have? All right, then let's move to the last question. And we kind of had these little nuggets of this conversation already in the previous minutes. So the question is, like, is it reasonable to expect cyber operations to avoid targeting these critical infrastructures? And we're talking here particularly about the context of peacetimes, right? Or is this an unrealistic expectation? And how do we establish this kind of accountability for harm that is caused by threats to critical infrastructure, especially when the agreed upon norms are being violated? So these are 2 kind of questions in one, but you are free to only answer to one of them. Maria, please go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. So first of all, I would like to talk briefly about what has been mentioned about the identification of critical infrastructure at the nation level. So I would here like to introduce the project that we have done at the DGAP. It's called German Council on Foreign Relations. If you have any questions, then you can come to me and I will really talk a bit more individually with you about it. So what we have tried to see is to identify or to look at every country in the world, all the 190 plus something nations worldwide, and see what each country considers as critical infrastructures. And one of our main takeaways is that it's very different worldwide. So for example, even when you check energy sector, this can mean very different things across the globe. And yeah, during our study, we're not trying to see, okay, you should consider this or that as critical, but rather to see how diverse it can be and how complicated it can be. So we're just like acknowledging that this is a huge task. Our second takeaway would be that there are still many, many countries all over the world. It was over 40% of countries worldwide that haven't publicly announced what is critical for them. So when I was doing this research, I was checking at all, I don't know, constitution, ministries, websites, etc., to see what is critical for them. But still, this DGAP tries to be as otherwise, again, is it better now? Thank you. So if you check the database and you see that and some countries that you know that they have defined it have been omitted, please let me know and we would love to introduce this. And regarding the accountability of these norms, I'm not the person that can say if they're gonna help or not in avoiding attacks on critical infrastructure during peacetime, but I think that at least the first step of a country saying, okay, this is critical for me, and then this respective country trying to create some type of critical infrastructure resilience and then getting in contact with the service providers and critical infrastructure providers is already gonna be a great step in order to promote the resilience of the providers. Because for example, our group where we were the critical infrastructure operator, and then we saw how many things can go wrong in 1 second and how interconnected we are. So yeah, these are my thoughts on this, but also if some people from our group wants to contribute or say or mention something, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, can I just pick up on this? So yes, this is one of the issues. We also in the Geneva dialogue had the questions like, we can endlessly talk about what is critical infrastructure and what is not. And it's actually complicated because there's a diversity across contexts. But yes, at some point there might be some exchange necessary to understand this. At the same time, we can go very simple and say electricity grids. It's probably in all contexts we would agree that's critical infrastructure, right? Okay, or nuclear power plants, right? Okay, so let's assume we have one definition in mind. Is it reasonable to expect and pursue norm violations that targeting, for example, electricity grids during peace times? Is this a reality? Is this something that's reasonable to expect, or are we like, yeah, well, probably not? I just remember we had Volt typhoon attack and the Salt typhoon attack in the US, where exactly these kind of things were prepared for. Vlada, go ahead.
This one is probably better. No, based on this, I'm thinking one thing is whether the states are going to avoid attacking each other, particularly in peacetime, which I guess, and I don't know if anyone here from the defense sector, but I suppose the defense sector would say, okay, if we have a conflict, there are no borders. And in peacetime, if we can call it a peacetime, I'm not sure they would avoid doing that. But I have another concern, is that sometimes it can be an attack against the Omni Cloud. And the attackers actually do not know that they will cause the spillover effect on one or more critical infrastructures. So we are back to that question, not only how we define critical infrastructure, but do we know the dependencies of all those critical infrastructure on the service providers, cloud, software, and so on?
Yeah, Dr. Bushra, please.
Yeah, I can reflect on that very good point that Vladimir raised. I think from a nation perspective, it's very important to define critical infrastructure, then define also the assets related to each sector and the sector lead and who's doing what. This is the first step, and this is what we did. This is what we did in Dubai. It took us a while till we came out with that model. What is critical, and then what are the critical services from a business point of view? It should be done absolutely from business point of view, and then you start defining the critical assets from IT point of view. Then we also did one more important exercise. What are the interdependencies between those critical infrastructure? What is the interdependency between the power sector and transportation sector? What if the power sector goes down? How the transportation will react? How all other sectors will react? And what are the countermeasures or the agreements that we need to take at the nation level? So I think starting from the national level is very important, and then building up the other types of collaboration at the regional level or international level are considered as next steps.
Thank you very much for this good illustration of how to identify these questions and interdependencies. Fantastic. So we're on the finishing line, and I'll hand back to to Nastya to give us our last closing remarks.
Yeah, and before that, if you allow it, just probably a quick follow-up question to Dr. Bushra, because that was a really important also aspect for the second chapter of the Geneva Manual. So Dr. Bushra, if you could quickly share, is there also a defined approach? How does Dubai approach the security of those interdependencies and services which are provided by foreign companies and overseas actors?
Yeah, just briefly, because for the sake of time, I think we are limited in time here. So we have plans for each interdependency. By the way, our critical infrastructure sectors is already in our website, descdesk.gov.ae. You can find the critical sectors, and for each sector we defined what are the interdependencies, and if one sector goes down, what we should expect from the other sector. For example, power sector, they said if our systems goes down, we are expecting that the critical infrastructure on the other side, transportation for example, they can react and they can operate for 4 hours till we bring up the service up. And in that case, transportation, they should make sure that they have generator that can operate if the power goes down in Dubai.
Thank you so much. Nastya, back to you.
Thank you very much. That was really helpful. We'll finalize on our side. We just wanted to briefly share the key insights, what we discussed virtually in our groups, and perhaps that might be also helpful, maybe some thought-provoking further for the audience on site. So we, from the cybersecurity research perspective, discussed the measures which should be mandated for critical infrastructure operators to protect the infrastructure, and some of the key insights. So we definitely, most of the inputs were about a better understanding of what's actually critical is, and understanding the asset inventory, what are those assets that needs to be protected, what are those dependencies, inward, outward, securing those dependencies, and looking also more comprehensively at your supply chain. The participants, we also discussed the importance of conducting impact analysis and threat assessment, given the regional and local specifics of the facilities and an infrastructure. And you also probably see that we specifically pointed out to the necessity to ensure the compliance with applicable standards and laws, and implement vulnerability management and securing the data. So that was some of the insights that we discussed so far. I will open the floor if anyone has any further comments from the virtual group. Yes, please, Kalim.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Just the last question, where we have been talking about the interdependencies as Anastasia, you mentioned about that how the overseas foreign actors, they come into picture. Normally what we did at the level of the country here is that we have a clear guideline which talks about it, that how the interdependencies, they have to be dealt with. So what we did is that we have come up with a full-fledged CIIP framework, and that CIIP framework is connected with the national a critical information infrastructure guideline, and which in a way supports the implementation of the CIIs. And that has a very clear baseline that how both overseas and the local CI operators, they have to interact with each other. So this is what we are basically trying to make sure this particular guideline, so that there is a clear cut actions that are required in order for them to carry out their risk assessment and then measure the gap in terms of the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses they have into their system, so that the CII operators, they are in a position to guide their operators in order to implement those. So thank you very much. That's the point which I wanted to make.
Probably time to wrap up. Thank you so much for the online group there. I hope you also had fun. Thank you all for being with us. I want to just with few lines close this. The next steps we are working on is trying to finalize the Geneva manual like this on the vulnerability disclosure and supply chain about critical infrastructure. The game we did is not finalized, so I hope by mid next year we'll have the next manual. We'll have the games as well, probably more cards, more scenarios. Everything will be open for the audience. Now, what is critical for us is that in this process of shaping the final document, we get as many voices, particularly around the world from developing countries, which honestly we're still missing. So if any one of you want or know someone of the companies, technical community, civil society, open source community regulators that want to get involved in Geneva dialogue and provide their feedbacks and experiences, please do. You'll find us around the Diplo booth over there today and tomorrow still, and you can always talk to us. And then with this, we close this discussion. We haven't mentioned much the civil society in this discussion. You'll notice that in discussions about vulnerability disclosure, we did have a particular actor on civil society. We should reflect on that more. But in the meantime, the next session here in this room is connecting to that. And the question is, how do we make sure that the global civil society gets more engaged in these sometimes rather technical discussions about standards, security, internet governance, and so on. So stay in the room for the next session or come back in 10 minutes. With that, I thank you so much and see you around.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for everyone who joined the line.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.